Thank you all for joining, and I will now introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Jackson is an associate professor of pediatrics in the section of critical care. He works as an attending physician in the pediatric ICU at Children's Hospital Colorado, and he also serves as a medical director for clinical ethics and as the PICU medical director for the Children's One Flight team. He is a current COMER member and former COMER pediatric panel chair. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for being here today, and I will pass things over to you.
Great, thank you. Just share my screen. Perfect. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about human participants in clinical research, really focusing on the human element and how we ensure that the people who participate in the research that we all are doing are kept safe, that we are following all the regulations for them, but more importantly, that we're centering the humanity of the people who are willing to participate in our research. I'm just going to skip a couple of disclaimers. The first is that I usually use language from the federal regulations about human subjects research and about ethics literature. Some of that language can be problematic. So the federal research regulations refer to people as subjects, which many have argued actually diminishes their value. So probably a more recent term that's come into favor is participants, but because the regulations still use subjects, that's what I use here. You'll see other examples like vulnerable populations or pregnant women and many others in this field. So just know that I am trying to use the federal terms when possible, but that there are problems with them. I also, when I'm talking about these topics, like to just give a warning that the information I'm presenting today will include images and other depictions of people who were harmed as a result of unethical research practice, including people who were harmed based on their religion, their gender, their sexual orientation, and other populations who may be at risk of exploitation. I also talk about World War II and some of the people who were harmed by research during that time, so just be aware that those will be here. And that all the photographs and other visual depictions I'm using are intentionally chosen to try to minimize further exploitation of people by taking them from sources like the U.S. Holocaust Museum. What are we going to be talking about today? There's three basic parts of the talk. The first is to talk about why we have research ethics for human subjects in general. And that will take us from previous to World War II all the way through present day to talk about places where there have been actually really good examples of research ethics and also places where research ethics have been problematic. Then we'll talk about some of the research ethics principles that we use today in human participant research. A lot of those come out of the Belmont Report and have been expanded upon since that was published more than 50 years ago. And then finally, we'll talk about the role of IRBs in the Common Rule, which may be familiar to many of you, but I think it's sometimes helpful to see behind the veil as to exactly how IRBs are functioning on the other side, if you're not a researcher, but actually an IRB member. So often when people talk about research ethics, they will say that research ethics really began in World War II. And to an extent, that might be true. But I think it's important to recognize that there were ethical standards for research that existed even before the atrocities that happened during the Second World War. The Prussian regulation of 1900, which I've included here, comes from what was probably the most medically advanced Western civilization at the time. And they actually did have medical ethics and research ethics that look not that dissimilar to what we'd use today, talking about ensuring consent of the individual participant, talking about making sure that there is review of research before it is conducted. And that existed as early as the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At the same time, despite that, when you look at the type of research that was being done then, it was being done on things like Hamlin's wizard oil or cocaine tooth drops. So certainly things were still different, but I think it's important to know that research ethics really did exist even before the Second World War. The Second World War is, I think, where most modern research ethics really takes hold. So what you see here are some of the examples of quote unquote research that was done during the Second World War in Germany. In the upper left with the measuring of the head there, you can see that was being used to compare folks of different head sizes to see if they had different levels of intelligence or if they could be tracked by different races. In the upper right, you have people who were intentionally infected with tuberculosis and then had lymph node biopsies to see the natural course of tuberculosis if it is untreated. In the lower right, perhaps one of the more difficult things to think about, this were people who were intentionally submerged in cold water to determine how best to have pilots who were shot down over some of the cold waters north of Europe be able to survive. And on the other side of that, the center picture is high altitude experimentation, where people were intentionally exposed to very low oxygen, low pressure conditions to see how long they could survive, knowing that most of them would in fact die. If this is a period of time that you're interested in, I highly recommend this book on the lower left. It's called The Nazi Doctors. It's very dense and long, and also very brilliant in terms of explaining exactly how medical professionals and research professionals were incorporated into the Nazi war apparatus to do the types of projects that you're seeing here. As World War II ended, there was recognition that much of what was done was bad, was unethical, and was immoral. And one of the places where a lot of the information that we have about what happened in World War II comes from are the Nuremberg trials. So following the war, many people who were part of the German state were put on trial for various things. The trial that I have pictured here is called the Doctors' Trial. It was a trial of medical professionals who were involved in both the quote unquote final solution, where many people were killed that you are probably familiar with, but also people who were involved in the quote unquote research studies that you just saw. They had a variety of outcomes from this trial, actually. There was one person who was found not guilty. The rest were all found guilty with sentences ranging from death to prolonged imprisonment. But perhaps more important than the trial itself was what came out of it. The judges who were involved in this trial developed what came to be called the Nuremberg Code. And this Nuremberg Code listed these 10 elements. So human voluntary consent, the experiments have to be good for society, the results have to justify the risks of the experiment, you can't intentionally cause physical or mental suffering, you can't experiment if there's a chance of death or permanent disability, you have to minimize risks, you have to have proper preparations and facilities to protect subjects, only qualified people should be doing the research, people can stop being in research at any time, and if you have new information about the project or about the research, you have to disclose that or stop the experiment. And so this code really became the basis for what modern research should look like when it involves human subjects and how people really should think about how they're doing their research. So everything was solved, right? Unfortunately, not so much. Many of you are probably familiar with several of the stories that are represented in the photos on this slide. So in the top left is at Tuskegee University. If you ever have a chance to visit, they have a whole set of exhibits related to research, and that's because of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Those, the United States Public Health Service actually looked at people who had been exposed to syphilis outside of the experiment, and instead of giving them known effective treatment in the form of antibiotics, they allowed the disease to progress until people had more severe complications, including neurologic manifestations of their disease. Perhaps even worse than that was the same public health service actually gave syphilis and gonorrhea intentionally to people in Guatemala at about the same time period, again, to try to understand better what the natural course of the illness would be. More recently, you may have seen The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, talking about how this woman who was Black and had cancer had her cells from her cancer taken and immortalized, became the first set of immortalized stem cells that were used across really around the world in various forms of experimentation, all without her knowledge or her family's knowledge or consent after she died. And then you'll see a few other things in here. So the center bottom slide here involves some tests where people were told that you would get free blood tests and free treatment for diseases, except that the treatment was actually a placebo intended to see what happened to people who had a variety of bloodborne diseases. So lots of experimentation that was clearly unethical. That was, I think, brought to the attention of many, especially scientists, but really the broader public, by what became to be called the Beecher Report. So Henry Beecher was a physician at Harvard in Boston. And he catalogs, I believe it's 26 separate examples in the United States of various research practices that violated the principles of that Nuremberg Code that we talked about. As a result of this, the US Public Health Service and several other government entities came together to write the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report is really what we use today when we talk about research ethics, and we'll go through this in more detail later in the talk. It was published in 1979 and identified 3 core ethical principles that are essential to really all forms of research that involves human people. The first is respect for persons, the second is beneficence or doing good, and the third is justice. And then it takes those 3 principles and actually applies them to specific areas, including informed consent, the assessment of risks and benefits, and the selection of subjects. So we'll talk more about what's actually in this report a little bit later on, but just timeline-wise, this was the late 1970s. Again, problem solved, right? Well, again, maybe not quite. So some more recent examples of places where research ethics have been called into question. So in the top left, this is an example that hits a little bit close to home, even though it took place in Minneapolis. This was a study that compared the use of ketamine with the use of standard of care drugs, mostly benzodiazepines like lorazepam, for people that EMS encountered in the field who were agitated. This study was done without the consent of any of the people involved, which was understandable because the people who were being treated in this study were folks who were not able to give consent because they didn't have decision-making capacity because of their agitation state at the time they were encountered. But when that happens, there's a whole process that you can go through to get community consent or community at least informing about what's happening in the study and to see if there are issues that you should be aware of as you're designing the study. And unfortunately, the University of Minnesota elected not to do that and instead followed a different pathway that eventually got them into quite a bit of trouble with the FDA. The lower right is a study that we actually participated in here at the University of Colorado. This was a study that looked at residents to see if having different medical resident shift schedules actually affected patient safety. The idea being maybe if we get rid of 24-hour shifts for residents, the patients will be safer because there will be more awake residents who aren't falling asleep while they're doing their job. On the other hand, having more shifts means that there are more handovers of patients with the potential to lose information about what's happening with those patients on a minute-to-minute basis. And so the study was designed to compare those things. The outcome of the study was whether patients were harmed, whether they had adverse events or mistakes made during their care. The problem was that only the residents were actually consented to be in this study. The problem with that part was that the residents probably didn't have a lot of ability to say no because they're in training programs where they're being evaluated, were being asked by their program directors whether they wanted to participate. But perhaps an even bigger issue was that the patients were the primary outcome of the study were not included as participants in the study at all. So the patients who were in the hospital were not aware the study was being conducted and were not really considered relevant to the study. They were just an outcome measure. And in retrospect, that was probably not the right way to treat those patients. Another example from the kind of 2000 aughts, I guess, that was published in 2010 was the SUPPORT trial. So this was a trial that was done in the neonatal ICU where the goal was to figure out what level of oxygen saturation is most beneficial to extremely preterm infants. The reason they did this study was that infants who have higher oxygen levels have a higher risk of a disease called retinopathy of prematurity, which can cause blindness, whereas lower oxygen levels give you a risk of damage to the brain. There were several problems with the study. Probably the biggest one was that parents who consented their infants to participate in this study were not informed well about what was known about these 2 different oxygen levels. What they were told was these are 2 different safe oxygen levels, either one of which is standard of care. There's no real decision to be made between the 2, so you should participate in the study, rather than being told information about how the high and low oxygen levels might have different results on their infant in terms of, which risk a parent might be more willing to take for their particular child. I think there was a lot learned about this. I will say the people who did the study actually still believe that their study was done well and that they followed principles and that they are correct, that there wasn't really a difference between the two groups of oxygen saturation numbers, but other groups have certainly criticized this over the years since then. If you're interested in learning more about some of the examples of research ethics problems, Public Citizen, which is a non-governmental, nonprofit organization, like a watchdog type group, actually keeps a list on their healthcare tab at their homepage of studies they've identified and have sent letters to various regulatory bodies about, so that you can actually read what they view as problems with various forms of research that are happening. And it's a great source if you're interested in learning more about the types of human subject research that can be problematic. So from there, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about kind of research ethics principles and the Belmont Report and where we are today in terms of what is included within research ethics. So I think the first thing that the Belmont Report does that can be particularly tricky for those of you working in the Cancer Center is define what actually is research. So the definition of research that exists right now is that research is an activity designed to test a hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, and thereby to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So what that means is that to distinguish between what is research and what is clinical care for a patient, we really have to think about what the goals of the particular treatment are. If the goal is really to benefit the individual patient, that's probably not research. If the goal is to create generalizable knowledge, so knowledge that would apply to other people with similar diseases or similar circumstances as the people involved in the study, then that does become clinical research. And as you can see, that it's gray really quickly, right? So how often do we give a child on an oncology trial, on a COG trial, for example, and they say that the medicines they're getting as a result of that trial are in fact designed to treat the cancer that child has, but they're also designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So is that human subjects research or is that clinical care? And that area becomes really gray. And so we tend to err on the side of more oversight is better. And so considering much of that work to be clinical research, even though it actually does have dual aims. I mentioned the principles in the Belmont Report. The first principle that the Belmont Report talks about is respect for persons. And they divide this into two kind of categories. The first is to have generalized respect for the autonomy of individual people to decide whether and how to participate in research projects. That requires that consent be voluntary. So that can come in a few different ways. One is to make sure that the person has decision-making capacity or the ability to understand and process the information and make a voluntary decision. The second is to make sure that that voluntary decision is truly voluntary. So it's not uncommon for people who are considering participating in research to have other factors that may diminish their ability to make voluntary decisions. For example, the residents in the study I'd mentioned earlier, or a person who is extremely poor and is offered money to participate in the study. That certainly occurs in the US. It also occurs in a lot of international research where researchers from wealthier countries will go to poorer countries and recruit people to participate for much less money than they would have to pay in the United States. Is that truly voluntary? The second component is to be given adequate information. For those of you who have worked with COMERB, our informed consent template is designed really to be able to make sure that people are given adequate information about a study. I think this is actually a pretty controversial area in research ethics right now, because there's also now concern that we're giving too much information to participants and not doing a good job of helping research participants to understand which of the components of informed consent are the key components and which of those components are less important. If we just list every possible side effect, and everybody's seen the television ads for medications, multiply that by a little bit and you get a research consent form with every possible thing that might go wrong. And so I think there's a lot of work being done to figure out if we can help personalize some of the informed consent information based on a particular potential participant's wishes. So some participants may say, actually, no, I do want to see everything that might possibly go wrong. Others may say, I only want to see the things that are likely, or I only want to see the things that are severe, and to be able to make the informed consent more understandable to folks. There's also a lot of work being done with, are there ways to use videos? Are there ways to use diagrams to give that information in a way that's easier for folks who are not experts in the research to understand the information that's provided? And then refusals need to be respected. So that has two components to it. One is making sure that medical care is continued despite the person's decision not to participate in research. So you can't abandon a patient and say, well, you're not going to participate in my research. We're not going to take care of you anymore. Then you'll have to go find somebody else. That's not okay. Neither is saying that we heard your refusal, but now we're going to try to persuade you to change your mind. The refusal needs to be accepted as a no and move on to another potential participant. That's kind of the respect for autonomy component. Diminished autonomy has to do with people who, for some reason, may not have as much ability to consent. So we talked a little bit about coercion. We haven't talked about yet, concern for excluding from the benefits of research. So that can happen with international research as well. So if I were to be a developer of a pharmaceutical product that's going to be quite expensive, and I went to go test it in a country where most people wouldn't be able to afford it, what I'm in effect doing is putting the people there at risk as part of my research study when they're unlikely to receive the benefits of the product if it is found to be effective and is eventually brought to market. And so how do we make sure that the people who are included in the research are the people who are benefiting from the research? Certainly that can occur domestically as well. A lot of medical centers are located in relatively impoverished communities. And so if you set community convenience samples, around the medical center where you work, you may end up recruiting people who are potentially less likely to benefit from an expensive intervention just by virtue of where you are, and so being aware of that risk. Other cases where diminished autonomy can come up are people who have significant mental illness that interferes with decision-making capacity, people who are children. So children may not have the ability to process information the same way that another person might. Those are also pieces to be aware of. The Belmont report then takes the principle of autonomy and applies it to informed consent. And so when they talk about informed consent, they talk about the information that's being provided, and that's what's shown in that sort of pie graph / diagram on the right side of the slide with the information that you would want to include in that informed consent process. And I think most folks are usually pretty familiar with if you've been involved in human participant research at all, what the treatment is, alternatives, benefits, risks, and opportunity to ask questions about it. Comprehension can be tricky to assess. Usually this means more than simply repeating the information back to you, but actually the ability to manipulate that information and to be able to use that information to make a decision that's consistent with the values that the person has. And then voluntariness, we've talked about how that can be a problem as well. So the principle of autonomy is perhaps best represented in how informed consent is done for people to participate in research. The second principle in the Belmont report is beneficence, which is fancy ethical talk that just means doing good. It usually is paired with its partner, which is non-maleficent, which means not doing bad, or do no harm, put more simply. And so when we do research, we don't want to be doing research that is likely to cause harm to the participants in that research. That becomes a more severe edict, the more severe the harm is. We also want to maximize the benefits, and this comes up commonly in clinical research when you're doing studies that might be screening for participation or safety studies as part of a lab, safety lab studies rather, as part of a project, where you really want to make sure that those results, if they're potentially actionable to the participant, are returned back to that participant, right? So if they're going to participate in the research, even though those are really intended to be research studies, if you find out that their hemoglobin A1C is 11 and they might have diabetes, you want to be able to give that information back to the participant in that research project. Similarly, we don't want to try and give drugs at doses that we know are inadequate just to see what happens. We want to make sure that if we are going to be exposing people to the risks of things like an experimental drug, we want to try and give them a dose that we think will be appropriate and helpful for them and help treat their disease or benefit them in some way. And then minimizing potential harm. So that can be as simple as trying to combine various studies that a person is doing. So, many of the patients who are on cancer studies are going to be getting clinically indicated labs. And so if you're able to combine research lab with those, that's a way to minimize potential harm. If there are ways to minimize pain or discomfort for people as you're doing procedures, absolutely should be doing things like that. So that a person, if they do experience harm, it should be as small a harm as possible. Beneficence is applied in assessing the risks and benefits. And so there's two kind of components to how the Belmont report talks about risks and benefits. The first is how the nature and scope of those risks and benefits applies. So it's important to know that those risks and benefits on both sides can accrue both to individuals and to groups. So I think it's pretty obvious on the individual side, right? You're consenting somebody to participate in a research study. You're going to be talking about the risks that that particular person will experience and the benefits that that particular person might experience. But it's also important to think about what might happen to a group. So if you do a study of, and this was actually done, alcoholism on Indian land in Arizona, and you find that alcoholism is much more frequent than it is on non-Indian land in Arizona, how does that potentially stigmatize the group that was involved in that study, or the Indian nation that was involved in that study? And are there risks to that group of people? Similarly, on the benefit side, even if the individual person who is participating in a study might have very little benefit from being in the study or even none at all, there can be benefit to others who have a similar disease or to society more generally. And those benefits are reasonable to consider as you're making a risk benefit decision. It's important also to think that risks and benefits are not just physical. So that can include things like stigma, as I'd mentioned, but can also include psychological harm. So finding out you have a disease more early than you might have realized it on your own could have legal implications. So a couple ways that can play out are that research records are typically not protected as well as clinical records from legal discovery if a person's in a lawsuit or in a criminal case of some kind. So there can be legal implications there. There can be legal implications if a research study uncovers something like child abuse or elder abuse, and how do you report that, and what does that mean for the individual and the group that's participating in the research? And then certainly economic harms and benefits can accrue as well for people who are spending a lot of time commuting to and from clinic visits, taking time off of work, missing time from school, all those sorts of things. And so we do try to make a decision, whether it's as an IRB or as an individual researcher or as a research ethicist, trying to weigh risks and benefits of a particular study, recognizing that there's certainly complexity when those risks can be different between individuals and societies. And how do you weigh those? There's no clear answer for how to do that. And that's one of the reasons that IRBs exists, is to try to get a multitude of opinions. There are some basic standards that we do follow, and that's on the right side of this slide, the minimum standards list there. So certainly no brutal or inhumane treatment. We minimize risks as much as possible. The more significant the risks, the more detailed the review and justification for exposing people to those risks. We call out specifically vulnerable populations to make sure that including them in the study is necessary for the scientific goals or for the benefits of the study, and that all of those risks, regardless of what they are, need to be included in the informed consent. The caveat I gave before that perhaps at some point in the future we'll have discussions about how to personalize those risks to an individual. Third principle in the Belmont report is the principle of justice, which is the equal distribution of the risks and benefits of research. But one of the troubles with justice is that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So some people might say it means that each person should have an equal share of whatever the resource is or what the risk and benefit is. Some might say that if you have more need, you should actually get more. And that would imply that there would be not equal distribution, but just distribution. Maybe the effort of the individual matters. Maybe the societal contribution of individuals matter. Maybe the merit of individuals matter. So all of these are posited as various theories of what justice should be. And so one of the problems when we talk about research is how do we think about distributing risks and benefits justly when justice can mean so many different things? One of the things we do try to do is to ensure that the risks and benefits are at least being distributed to the same groups of people. So what that means, like I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, is that if you are exposing a particular population to the risks of research, that population should be likely to benefit from the research. Even if the individual you're exposing may not be the person who benefits, the group of people to which that individual belongs should be able to benefit from the research. And we want to make sure that the results of the research itself also is benefiting those people. So it's not just within the study; it's also once that study is published and whatever diagnostic treatment, whatever thing you learned, really ought to benefit the people who help to develop the knowledge. This has come up a little bit in the context of cost drugs. So some of you may have seen news stories about new drugs for various genetic conditions that cost on the order of $3 to $4.5 million as a one-time drug that at least significantly modifies, if not completely cures, the disease that a person has, things like sickle cell disease or spinal muscular atrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Some of the research that was done for that was funded by and done by various nonprofit advocacy groups in those fields and or by the NIH, and yet the money that is coming into the manufacturers of those drugs does not go back to those groups, and there are no discounts or any other benefit to those groups who participated. But is that really a just way to conduct research and have the benefits and risks of research accrue to the correct people? There's a lot of discussion about that that's occurring in the ethics world and in some of the financial healthcare sector world. So the way that the Belmont Report applies justice is to subject selection, talking about both individual and social factors that might affect which subjects you choose. And also, actually, even in the 1970s, was talking about the structural factors that may put particular research participants or groups of research participants at a disadvantage when they participate in research, whether that's because they don't understand what they're getting into or they won't benefit from that research in the end. It talks about institutionalized populations, which typically means people who are either incarcerated or involuntarily hospitalized for mental illness, that those groups in particular are at particular risk of exploitation. And because of that, we need to be very careful if we're including them. And the benefit of that research very clearly needs to accrue to people who are incarcerated or people who are involuntarily hospitalized. Similarly, for children, you can't include or other vulnerable populations, you can't include them in research unless there's a benefit that's likely to accrue to that vulnerable population. That's kind of an overview of what research ethics itself looks like. The last part of the talk is really just kind of talking a little bit about IRBs and how the Common Rule, which is the federal regulation that governs IRBs and clinical research, applies. I think the first thing to know is that the Common Rule is this particular federal regulation, 45 CFR Part 46. It's been adopted by actually 19 now federal departments and agencies, including the Department of Labor. This rule applies to any research that is federally funded by one of these agencies. Having said that, most large research institutions apply it to all research because they get federal money for centralized research work, and it's very difficult to distinguish what's being funded by a federal agency that's covered by the Common Rule and what's not, so they just apply the same regulations across the board. I also would just note that the FDA, you'll notice, is not included on this list. However, the FDA has a very similar set of federal regulations that are almost, but not identical to the Common Rule that applies to research that's governed by the FDA. So there's a few minor differences, but in general, the rules are very similar. Common Rule is what requires human subject research to go through an institutional review board or an IRB. This is what the Common Rule sets out for IRB membership anywhere you go in the country. You have to have at least 5 people. You have to have at least one scientific expert on the panel and at least one person who is not a scientific expert. So we often call that a lay person or a non-sci reviewer. You have to have at least one person who is not affiliated with the institution that the IRB belongs to. So that means somebody from outside, a community member. These people can be paid by the institution for their work on the IRB, but they can't otherwise work with the institution. So often those are people who have some interest in research from out in the community. It might be an attorney or a patient advocate or things like that from out in the community. And it is allowed for that non-affiliated person to be the same as the non-scientific person if they meet both those criteria. There are regulations requiring special reviewers for vulnerable populations. So like for kids, we have to have people who are experts in pediatrics. For populations that are incarcerated, we have to have a prisoner advocate, those kinds of things. And then the IRB is allowed to invite other observers or experts to participate in their discussions. They don't vote, but they're able to provide expert guidance on topics that the IRB may not be familiar with. Types of review are out there for IRB reviews. The first is what's called exempt review. Exempt review is for very low risk research, like most retrospective reviews, educational materials, anonymous surveys, things like that. Expedited review is for research that is defined as minimal risk. Minimal risk is actually specifically defined as the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests, which is actually a pretty high bar, especially when we talk about some of the complex research we do on an academic campus. Often we're doing research like you all are with folks who are already suffering from a significant disease like cancer or other diseases that we might see at a large academic center. But the regulations don't really account for that. And they talk about kind of regular person walking down the streets risks, not the risks that a person who already has cancer is being exposed to. It can make it a little bit tricky to think about what would qualify for that expedited review. Expedited reviews are typically done by a designated person from the IRB. Here at CU, that would typically be by one of the IRB chairs. But it can be any member of the panel that's appointed by the IRB to do that review. And then those are kind of collectively reviewed en masse at meetings so that everybody else on the IRB kind of knows what got approved through an expedited process. The board is a classic IRB review with all the people I'd mentioned on the last slide together. And that's for any research that doesn't meet those two categories above that still involve people. These are the specific things that the IRB has to determine in order to approve research. And you'll see that these echo pretty closely the things that we talked about from the Belmont report, so that the risks to subjects are minimized, risks are reasonable relative to benefits, subject selection is equitable, either informed consent will be sought or there is a waiver in place. I'll talk about that in a second. That there's a safety monitoring plan, that there's provisions to protect privacy and confidentiality, and that vulnerable populations have been thought about. So the consent requirement. So in general, the kind of baseline assumption is that any research that involves people requires consent. I'll talk next slide about where that doesn't apply, but we're going to start from kind of the general framework that all research that people are involved in requires them to consent to that research. The things that the IRB is looking at for that consent requirement are that the consent itself is in understandable language, is in the language that the participant speaks or hears, and that the circumstances where consent is being done are appropriate. So that last piece sometimes trips people up, but that means that you really want to have a place where you can have a focused conversation with the potential participant about the informed consent. You don't want it to be in either a public place where you might be overheard, a loud, noisy, distracting place, a place where the participant might be under a lot of stress. You want that to be in a place where the participant really has time to think and reflect. You'll see there the list of the elements of consent that are actually specifically outlined in the federal regulations for what has to be in the consent. I'll just call out a couple I haven't mentioned yet. A confidentiality statement that includes assuming that the information will be confidential, that it is confidential, or if parts of it are not confidential, which parts those are and who you'd be sharing it with and how. So that could apply, I'd mentioned before, child and elder abuse as a potential exception. Large database sharing can be an exception. If you're collecting information that you'll be sending to a database and shared with other researchers, you'd want to make sure you include that. Compensation for injuries. So this is also often a tricky spot for a lot of investigators in terms of what happens if somebody does get sick from that study drug you're given, or if they have syncope while they're getting their blood draw in the research lab. Who's going to pay for the ER visit or the doctor visit that that person needs? And that will vary a little bit based on who is funding the research and local institutional policy. I'd mentioned that there are ways that research can be conducted without consent. There's two processes listed here. The first is a waiver or alteration of consent, which means that you don't have to actually get informed consent from participants to be in the research. This only applies to minimal risk research, using that definition before of risks encountered in everyday life. You still need to take steps to protect any information that might be identifiable. You have to be able to document that what you're doing is not going to affect the rights or the welfare of the person whose information you're seeing. And when it's appropriate, you have to provide information after. The most common place that this waiver comes up is in chart reviews, where you may not directly contact an individual. Minimal risk research are not likely to be harmed by it. You're still storing the information you're collecting in a secure database, REDCap or some other secure database, so that you're protecting it. It's not going to adversely affect their rights or welfare. And typically in that context, we won't require information to be provided afterward. Those participants. There are other circumstances where you do have direct contact with that individual. A waiver of documentation of consent would mean that you are still going through a consent process, but you're not going to have them sign or e-sign a consent document at the end of that consent process. And there's two reasons that can be, three reasons, I guess, where that can be allowed. The first is if the only record linking the participant to the research is the consent document. So they're filling out an anonymous survey, and then you ask them to write their name on a consent form. That would be the only place where their name would appear or any other identifier would appear. They can be given the option to not put their name on the form, and that's okay. And we would go through and approve a process to demonstrate that. The second, it would be for minimal risk research where written consent is not typically required outside of the research context. So that might be a person who is completing an identified survey, right? Normally, we don't ask people to sign informed consent to complete surveys. We might just ask them to click a yes, like a head box, or I'm going to fill out the survey. Or sometimes we might even say that because they filled out the survey, they were in effect consenting to participate in the research. And the third is pretty uncommon, but if you're from a group where signing documents is not the norm, and another method to recognize consent exists. So for people who don't use written forms for this type of work, if you're in a particular culture where that's not the norm, there is actually an exception that that. I'd mentioned that ketamine study out of Minnesota, and this is the process that I think they should have used probably. This is the emergency exception from informed consent. And this is really designed for a situation where you know in advance you're going to be enrolling people where they're probably not going to be able to give you consent because the treatment needs to be given, or the research procedures need to be done rather, before you have a chance to get consent, either because the patient's incapacitated or things are happening too quickly. So the places where this can occur are life-threatening situation where the existing treatments are unproven or unsatisfactory. But I think that the situation in Minnesota would actually have fit that pretty well, because the EMS there was pretty confident that what they were doing was not the best thing out there, and there was probably better options for what they could be using in the field. And certainly the agitation that you're calling 911 for could be considered a potentially life-threatening situation. Obtaining informed consent would not be feasible in that circumstance because the person doesn't have the capacity to give informed consent. There's a possibility of direct benefit because the study medication that you're using is potentially more helpful. Without the waiver, I think that's true. You'd want to try and contact the patient's legal representative as quickly as possible. Once you contact them, you'd want to have an informed consent document to share with a surrogate decision maker for that patient who would be able to sign it. And then the pieces that I think are really important is that after you've gone through all that, you actually go to the community before you start the research and say, hey, community, this is what we are planning to do. What concerns do you see with the research that we're doing or that we're proposing to do in your community? Are there ways that we could make this more palatable? Are there other things we should be doing? We disclose that the study exists. So that means generally sharing at things like public meetings, posting an ad in a newspaper. If you're doing a study of people who are likely to be at the hospital, it might include putting up flyers in the hospital or sending notifications via MyChart, those kinds of things. After the study is done, you again have to go through that process to actually disclose the results to those groups. That's part of that idea that the benefit should accrue to that population. So they should know what happened to them and what you learned from them. And then you do have to have an independent monitoring committee to make sure that everything you're doing is still considers the interests of the people who are not able to consent. So that's what EFIC is. We have had several studies here on the Anschutz campus that have used an EFIC process that meet all these criteria. So this is something that's feasible to do for that emergency type research. So IRB also considers vulnerable populations. So there are specific regulations related to pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. For people who are pregnant, there are requirements for when the father must be involved in the decision making. So it's not all the time, but there are circumstances where the father actually has to be involved in the consent process. For neonates, the rules are based on whether the infant is thought to be viable or not, meaning that they'd be able to live outside of life support being given to them. There's a regulation for prisoners, like I talked about. So either a prisoner or a prisoner representative on the IRB panel that's reviewing. You can't have like benefits that would be so high that it could be coercive. So you can't say I'll put $10,000 in your commissary account. That would likely be coercive in an institutional environment, maybe also in a non-institutional environment. Maybe a smaller amount would be more appropriate for an incarcerated population. Or you'll get extra time where you're not kept in a cell, you're allowed out to the yard. Those kinds of things could be coercive. You can't have more risks to the prisoners, and you can't have the prison administrators or parole officers or prison guards saying that, well, we want these people to participate because they're the people who are behaving the best while they're incarcerated, because that certainly leads to justice and bias concerns in selection. And then for children, there are different rules based on whether the research is minimal risk or not, requiring whether one parent or two parent must consent, and how much benefit has to accrue to either the individual child or to the population of children with the same disease as the child. Those are a little bit complex rules. I'm happy to go into more detail if anybody's interested. So the outcomes from an IRB, these are kind of the options that we have. We can approve the study the way it was submitted. That's actually pretty rare. Almost always, as I'm sure you all know, we will find something that we want changed, but it does happen. More commonly, you'll get the approval with minor modifications, which means that in general, the IRB believes that the research is doable, but there's something that needs to be fixed in order to either protect subjects better or comply with regulations better. Deferral means that there are significant issues with the research project that require significant modifications, so it'll have to be re-reviewed from scratch. Rejection means that the research is not doable. Nothing similar is doable. I will say in my time, I don't think we've ever actually outright rejected a study, because we do try to work to find ways to make research projects feasible while still protecting the people who participate and making sure they comply with regulations. And then just to know that the IRB can also suspend or revoke approval for previously approved research if they find that there is misconduct or things were misrepresented in the initial documentation. And so with that, I wanted to leave about 10 minutes for questions. It looks like we're right there. I can make this up. Great. And I am happy to take questions. I don't know what your approach is for questions. If chat or people unmuting is easier, or what you prefer for this forum.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your wonderful and very informational presentation. As you mentioned, we have some time for questions, so please feel to either unmute or type your question into the chat, and we can help moderate.
Hi, I have a quick question. How do we balance the protections for vulnerable patients and vulnerable groups with ensuring that it's not used to exclude populations who should be involved? I'm thinking specifically of like the pregnant women or pregnant people who were expected to serve on frontline during COVID, but were told that they were not eligible for vaccines. And I know plenty of them lied about being pregnant and got them anyway. And so how do we make sure that pregnant people are not excluded from research, because it might make it awkward for the team rather than it being a scientific approach?
Yes, it's a really big topic. There's actually been some potential rulemaking from the federal government related to exactly that, both for pregnant people as well as for children, because the same thing has applied to children, where children don't get access to drugs or vaccines as quickly as adults, because typically the way the regulations are written now, you'd have to do a study on adults who are not pregnant first, And then you could go on to do the studies on people who are pregnant or on children. And so you're basically waiting an entire lifetime of a second study before you get the approval for pregnant people or children. And so there is discussion about trying to stratify that risk better. So is this a study that is likely to have additional harm for children or pregnant people or whatever the vulnerable population is? Or is this one where the risks are actually likely to be pretty evenly spread out across different populations, and so you actually could include them up front? There's been some pushback on that even if the risk is equal, that we should expose adults who are not pregnant to that risk before pregnant people or children. I don't know what the outcome will be, but that is definitely a hot topic in the research ethics world. I think COVID was a large part of the reason why for both of those populations that didn't get approval to access the vaccines until later. Through the range of clinical trials, beginning with first-in-human trials all the way to post-marketing trials, which type of trials do you find most difficult to assess the potential benefits and risks for participants? That's a really good question. I think there's a couple places where that comes up. I actually think that the hardest one for IRB to assess right now are large-scale implementation research studies, because it's really hard to assess, first of all, what's research and what's not in that context. And second, how much risk and consent do people have for studies that are being done on a large scale where we think we know what the right thing to do is from previously conducted more controlled research. Now we're trying to apply this to large populations, and how do we ensure that those populations are adequately informed and protected without undermining the ability to do the research? And I think that's been a really difficult area. I think in terms of the actual approval process, actually the hardest place is probably the earliest phases, because we don't have a good sense of risk, and disclosing uncertainty to participants who are not trained in research or medicine or ethics is really challenging. It's really hard to figure out how to explain to a person who is going to have a drug that we don't know the effects of, either beneficial or harmful, what exactly they're getting into. And so to me, that's actually a really hard thing to put into a consent and to assess the risk benefit from an IRB standpoint. So what are unique considerations for cancer research studies, especially with patients who may be extra motivated to have a chance to try new therapies? Yeah, so we worry a lot about coercion in cancer studies, or undue influence, even if it's not truly coercive, where patients feel like they don't have a choice, or their choice is either we're going to die or try this research study. Do they really have the ability to make a free voluntary choice at that point? And how do we explain, like, we don't want to lie to them, because those may actually be the options that person has, right? Like, they may not have other clinically approved options. And if that's the case, how do we make that clear to a person without making them feel like they therefore have to be included in the research? I think one of the other places we can sometimes run into trouble is trying to figure out how to explain that we're going to be following the same pathway regardless of whether the person is on a study or not. So we're going to be using the same set of chemotherapy or radiation therapy or whatever the treatment is for the particular cancer that you would get on study, even if you don't elect to join the study. And how do we explain why that would be to a patient or a family member who's trying to decide whether to be in a study or whether to get treatment off study? I think those are a couple places where those discussions come up in discussions with the IRB and sometimes with our research ethics team.